we're going to talk about like who we are as human beings, and it's going to tie back to Christianity ultimately. We're not just going to talk about the brain, but some objections that recent scientists have been posing out there in the popular media and the major articles. If you follow some of the recent scientific articles like Science Daily or a psychology journal, if you prescribe to that, you'll get a lot of really interesting kind of mind-boggling things about the brain and mind-boggling. And so I don't really have a theme for tonight's talk. It's going to be into like 3 different sections. First, we're going to talk about some of the recent claims by modern scientists about how they compare humans to the rest of the animals and just humans, the material human being. And then we're going to go to briefly, just a philosophical objection to how we are not just our brains, so how we can respond as Christians to the claim that we are just our brains. So kind of providing a defense. And then number 3, we're going to go to the orthodox view of the human being and how that holistic worldview is, it's even way beyond just science. And we have so much to contribute to it, more than just, synapses and brains firing. And, there's something so mystical about the brain that even science is in awe at. So if you think, some people do say that the human being is just, I have potential, yes, is a highly evolved mammal. And the difference really in humans is that we have larger brains capable of reason, thought, religion, music, love, all those kinds of things. And that is the major thing that you'll learn in almost any basic psychology, neuroscience class. Humans have a larger cerebral cortex, which equals more function, and that's what makes them human. So if this is the definition of the human being, is that we are highly evolved mammals, then, or we are just that, then where does salvation fit into the picture? Do we have souls? Do we have that kind of stamp from God? And some of the quotes that we can see is Ingrid Newkirk. She is the president of PETA, which is the People for Ethical Treatment of Animals. She says, a rat is a pig, is a dog, is a boy. And this is a book written by actually an Orthodox Christian, his name is Wesley Smith, on the idea of human exceptionalism. That humans are unique, on a secular level, we can still argue about why humans are unique, but also theological reasons. It's true as that. But in general, Ingrid Newkirk and many people like her in academia and in other like ethical types of philosophy, they will say that humans are just like every other animal. And if you don't believe it, then I'll share some quotes with you. But this is part of the animal rights movement, which is very popular, actually, extremely popular. The smallest form of life, even an ant or a clam, is equal to a human being. We feel animals have the same rights as a retarded human child. 6 million Jews died in concentration camps, but 6 billion broiler chickens will die this year in slaughterhouses. So kind of the comparison between human life and other animal life. And this is from PETA, from advocates of PETA. By the way, PETA has billions of, advocates, billions of advocates. I'm sorry? Oh, millions, sorry. I'm thinking of 6 billion broiler chickens. I mean, they have 6 billion broiler chickens advocating for oh yeah, the older fate, yeah. But I mean, it might seem kind of humorous, but it gets better. So is it really that, humans and animals share, a lot of the same genetic information, and we can track our DNA and all that kind of, cool science stuff that tells us humans and chimpanzees are like 95% identical in DNA sequence? And also, I know I'm kind of last 2 weeks ago I had bananas out on the screen too. Do you remember that? But it's interesting because we share more than 50% of our DNA sequence with bananas also. So yeah, such an honor. Does that kind of, yeah. So how much does a biological account of humanity should we really care for when we explain or say what a human being actually is? So are we 50% banana? Are we 95% chimpanzee? Obviously not. I mean, a human being is a human being, Homo sapien, whatever you want to call it. And this is from a local professor, Peter Singer at Princeton here. He actually says that human babies are not born self-aware or capable of grasping their lives over time. They are not persons. Hence, their lives would seem no more worthy of protection than the life of a fetus. He also suggested that an infant up to a 1 month old can be killed, and that would be totally okay because it's not self-aware. And he's, by the way, a bioethicist, and he is opposed to the death penalty under any circumstances, which I thought was an interesting kind of perspective. But we have from our church fathers, Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century, he gives a really interesting perspective on this because the same kind of issue was happening during their time when people were equating the human being to the rest of the animals. And this quote says, they say that man is a little world composed of the same elements with the universe. Those who bestow on human nature such praise as this by a high-sounding name forget that they are dignifying man with the attributes of a gnat and the mouse, for they too are composed of the 4 elements. Back then they believed that there were 4 elements. Because assuredly, about the animal nature of every existing thing we behold apart, greater or less. In what then does the greatness of man consist? According to the doctrine of the church, not in his likeness, not to the created world, but in his being in the image of the nature of the Creator. I know it's a very long quote, but he basically is saying that, yeah, people are showing the similarities between animals and humans, but there is another additional layer that we as Christians and as the church, we add to it. And people, shouldn't be dignifying humanity based on, the likeness of other animals, but because we're made in the likeness of the Creator. Dave?
I usually ask you to go back to the last slide. I just want to...
Can we do it later?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so perspective matters because, for example, like Richard Dawkins, who's an atheist, he is the atheist, he says that with respect to those meanings of human that are relevant to the morality of abortion, any fetus is less human than an adult pig. And I'm not going to get into a discussion right now about abortion or anything like that, but just showing that perspective does matter and how we engage in our, society with other people who might think that same way. But St. Basil the Great, he says that the human being is an animal who has received the vocation to become God. He's called to theosis. So, this is a totally different view. He's still saying a human being is an animal, but it's a different kind of animal. There's a different function and a calling for humanity. So this issue matters because it has to do a lot with the morality of abortion, euthanasia, and assisted suicide. Cures for diseases, should we even be doing animal testing? Some people say we shouldn't be doing animal testing at all, and that it's enslaving the animals. Mental versus brain conditions, are they going to be lumped together? Some people say that certain addictions are brain conditions, but other psychiatrists and psychologists do disagree a lot with neuroscience. They say no, a lot of them are mental more than they are neurological conditions. criminal justice, should people be held accountable? If your brain made you do it, then why should I be held accountable for what nature told me to do? I was born this way, or this is just how I naturally, act. And the ethical treatments of animals and the environment. And for us, the theological questions we want to ask is, do we have free will? Is there life after death? Is there salvation in Jesus Christ? What does that even mean? Does humanity need to even be saved? And if so, then from what? And finally, is God a delusion? So So those are like the questions, and I'm not going to answer them. I'm just posing them out, for us to kind of think about, or to kind of ignore if you're not interested. But these are really important questions that people will ask us as Christians, to provide an answer for. And this stems from the idea that as we have to define a human being either as a dual being, meaning that they have a mental and a physical part that are separate. So this goes back to the idea of substance dualism by René Descartes, that the mental and the physical are two separate things, and that the body is almost like a prison, and that's also Platonic. Like the body is almost like a prison, and the spirit is a different kind of stuff and is independent of your body. And when you die, your soul is released, and you get to go to heaven, or whatever. And this is actually popular among some modern Christians who hold on to this substance dualism. The opposite side of the spectrum, which tends to be the view in some modern scientists, is that we're just material, we're a machine made up of different materials, and there is nothing beyond matter. So we're just essentially made up of matter, and it's this fundamental substance in nature. And where does our orthodoxy fall into that? Do we fall in between? On either side? What exactly? So one of the objections that we talked about last week and the week before was metaphysical naturalism. It's the idea that nothing but matter exists, so it's equivalent to atheism. And this is the famous quote by Daniel Dennett, who is an atheist. He says, "An impersonal, unreflective, robotic, mindless, little piece scrap of molecular machinery is the ultimate basis for all the agency, and hence meaning, and hence consciousness in the universe." So this is kind of the idea that we would object to, or we want to engage with, and try to find an answer. Is that really true? Can a piece of molecular machinery really produce this kind of complex, human being and consciousness and thought and all that? And people have objected. But really, I'll get to some quotes because there are some really interesting quotes. So the meat of the issue is the human brain. And it's a 3-pound thing of wet mass. And the average human brain has about 100 billion neurons. Each neuron has 10,000 synapses, so it makes about 10,000 synapses with other neurons, which is resulting in about 100 trillion synapses in the brain. And that is 1,000 times the number of the stars in the entire galaxy. So it's a pretty big number. It's kind of incomprehensible to wrap your mind around. And another interesting fact, the human brain's memory capacity is 1 to 1,000 tetrabytes. I just heard this word recently. Terabytes. Oh, terabytes. Thank you. So an example of that is the 19 million volumes in the US Library of Congress represents about 10 terabytes of data. So that's 19 million volumes in the library, which is the largest in the US. And our brains are, on average, more than that. So that's kind of food for thought. And physicist Sir Roger Penrose, he's...
You're making so many puns about.
Oh, I am? Sorry.
Yeah.
He says, if you look at the entire physical cosmos, our brains are a tiny, tiny part of it. but they're the most perfectly organized part. Compared to the complexity of a brain, a galaxy is an inert lump. So then this is the idea of, we are so complex in just our brains, and, how could we really understand that? Does anybody have any idea, like thoughts about that, kind of brain? From the what?
Brain capacity perspective, how we compare to other primates. So if we have 10, from 1 to 1,000 terabyte of capacity, what is a monkey have?
Yeah, I didn't do comparison. Do you know off the top of your head? Like, it's.
We have parts of the brain that they don't, but.
Yeah, the frontal lobes we have highly developed.
But all the stuff with higher level processing, so the prefrontal cortex and all that kind of stuff we have that they don't have.
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, it's just as complicated.
Yeah.
I feel like most mammals have very complex brains. It's just different parts that are missing.
Right. So, yeah, different primates also have very complex brains. So that's why in the beginning I said, is the difference just that we have larger brains or a cerebral cortex, which is really where you see the main difference. And if you want to look at the brain, we have larger, outer parts of the brain. And this is a quote by C.S. Lewis, kind of responding to the idea that we are just molecules in motion, that we are just physical things kind of moving along, dancing to our DNA, as Dawkins would say. And he says, suppose there was no intelligence behind the universe, no creative mind. In that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose of thinking. It is merely that when the atoms inside my skull happen, for physical or chemical reasons, to arrange themselves in a certain way, this gives me as a byproduct the sensation I call thought. It's like, but if so, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? It's like upsetting a milk jug and hoping that the way it splashes itself will give you a map of London. But if I can't trust my own thinking, of course I can't trust the arguments leading to atheism, and therefore have no reason to be an atheist or anything else. Unless I believe in God, I cannot believe in thought. So I can never use thought to disbelieve in God. It's kind of like a very profound quote, and you might take a picture or look it up to really meditate on it. But the idea is, if we're just responding to those physical electrochemical reactions in our brains, then how can I even trust my own thinking if it's not really programmed to tell me truth about the world? It's evolutionary programmed merely for survival. So how can I trust that I know truth and anything? And even atheism, how can I trust that atheism is the true worldview? So it goes both ways. Even atheist, very famous atheist, Thomas Nagel says in his book, this is the book, his title, Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. So he goes on to say that the materialistic Darwinian view of evolution in terms of how complex and how consciousness came about in this universe it's not accounted for by the evolutionary process, and it's almost impossible that thought would have risen, came about just from these random, non-purposeful, unguided things, So this is an atheist, by the way, who says he hopes that there is no God. He doesn't want the world to be that kind of place. So it's an interesting perspective. So for, yeah.
What does he propose as an alternative?
He doesn't. He thinks that there is inherently in matter, there is mind behind matter, inherently just in the material world. It's almost like a pantheistic type of thing, but he would never call it God.
Right.
But he doesn't explain, because I read a summary of...
So there's intelligence that's there embedded, but it's not theistic.
Yeah,
Atheistic.
yeah, it's still, he's still atheistic.
But he's saying that he doesn't believe that it could be unguided.
Yeah, he thinks that it has to be guided by something, but that couldn't possibly be God.
Yeah.
Not because he wants his atheism to be true. He actually says, I just hope that I don't want God to exist. Like, I simply just don't want that hypothesis. So he doesn't really give an alternate explanation, but even like Charles Darwin in a very famous quote, he said, like, how can you trust the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any such convictions? And if we're just evolved from monkeys' brains, it kind of, the logic follows. How can you trust the convictions of a human mind? But so for someone who is an atheist or doesn't believe in God or views the world as just, you know, matter and that's an end to itself, you have to explain how in the beginning were the particles and how that gave rise to consciousness and thought and intelligence. But for us as Orthodox Christians, we would say, well, we have an explanation. We don't have a problem with the brain. We don't have a problem that the brain fires and, you know, it gives us thought and it generates consciousness and it determines our behavior. It's a different kind of determinism, obviously, but we believe that in the beginning was the Logos. So in the beginning was the Word, was God himself, who is intelligent and created us with a purpose. So we would be not surprised to see that our brain, you know, our brain scans tell us something about ourselves. So in one of the famous studies, I'm going to review very briefly some of the research out there that talks about how we don't have free will or that God is an illusion. One of the most famous studies is by Benjamin Libet, and it's a very famous one where he tries to prove that we don't have free will. So he will have participants sitting in front of a button and a clock, and they're wired with an EEG, and they have to, the researchers are asking them to say when they have the desire to press the button. So and then they press the button. So they're measuring when the person has a desire and when they press the button and seeing the difference between the two. And what they found was that there are parts of the brain that actually were activated before the person had the conscious desire to press the button. So a part of the brain fired about like 500 milliseconds before the person said, I want to press the button now. So then they concluded that therefore humans don't have that free will. It was just predetermined by the brain, and the person acted on something they didn't consciously plan for. And there have been a lot of critiques of that study because it doesn't really measure free will. It just measures, is it confusing?
No, it just measures reaction time.
Well, no, I mean, because they're supposed to say when they have the desire. So before they said, I have the desire to press the button now, their brain already fired up. Their brain, parts of their brain had like activation, like 500 milliseconds before that.
Right, but
So they're waiting.
it took 500 milliseconds for them to communicate that they had the desire.
Right. Well, that's one of the critiques. Yeah, no, that's one of the critiques, is that it's also just, it could be measuring like the motor planning piece, like planning to do a movement in the brain, and not really the actual, the desire, the volitional aspect, because those can be controlled by different parts of the brain. But now you're thinking like a neuroscientist. And then one of the other objections is that God is in your brain, and this was a famous study that, I mean, I learned about all these things in school, and, you know, being a Christian, and I was kind of challenged by these, because not knowing anything about anything, I was just like, oh, really? God is in my brain? Like, this is what they taught me. There's a God helmet study, and like what they do is put a helmet on your head, and it does like a magnetic stimulation of your temporal lobe, which is like this part of your brain right here. And the participants who were in the study, they had feelings of a presence of some kind of like demon or angel, or they just felt like there was something divine it's almost like a hallucination. So basically what they did was generate almost the equivalence of temporal lobe epilepsy, which is very, well, I mean, it's a very like low level stimulation, but the researcher, this became a very popular study because the researcher said, well, this is what happens with religious people, that if you just they're having almost like an epileptic type of experience. And I actually learned that, I don't know if you've ever learned that, but that St. Paul had epilepsy. No? Okay. I learned that in my neuroscience class 3 times, because I took 3 out of 8 my courses. I learned that St. Paul had an epilepsy. And so I was like, how did they diagnose him? Like, did they have fMRIs back then? But it's kind of this logic that if you have an experience, we can explain it using, this, we can replicate it somehow, and therefore it must be that, or, and obviously it's a stretch. I mean, it's bad logical thinking. But it's a good way to trick people or to deceive them. Another objection is that spirituality is just in your brain. So people who are spiritual generally just have different brains, and that just explains why we go to church and we pray and we meditate and do quiet time and all those kinds of things. And there was a study on Catholic nuns and Tibetan monks, and what they found was during their experiences of prayer and meditation for the monks, that there is high activation in certain areas of the brain. And interestingly, these researchers they didn't say that, spirituality is a delusion. They actually said that the brain is hardwired for these kinds of experiences. So, which is, I mean, it's kind of interesting. But people reading that study will say that, well, God and it's not real. It's all an illusion. It's all just generated by your brain. So a person is having these experiences that are just generated by their brain, and we can measure it. And when we measure it, and there's no objective correlation, like it's not like God is right there and you're praying to him. So those kinds of like conclusions will come from these studies. But the researchers also say, well, so is eating an apple pie. It's in your brain. I mean, if you give someone an apple pie and you measure their brain state, you obviously see that there are parts of the brain that are lighting up while the person is eating the apple pie. Does that mean that the apple pie therefore doesn't exist? Like, if you're thinking about me, about the presentation after we leave and we do electrodes and find that your brain is firing or something, does that mean that I don't exist, or that I never gave a talk, or you're just having an illusion? Or obviously, not. So they concluded that we are hardwired to be spiritual, that the brain has naturally that capacity for spiritual experiences. And that's actually really interesting, because we remember the news, that we have this intuitive way of knowing spiritual things and knowing God, and that's innate in us as humans. So they concluded in the article that all that is meaningful in human spirituality happens in the mind. In other words, the mind is mystical by default. So it kind of goes back to what you were saying, like the mind, it's a mystery, it's mystical, and that's fine. That's a fine way of looking at it. Doesn't mean that God doesn't exist or things are just, they're not real. Another interesting one, in light of the elections, there was a study for swing voters, people who are not really affiliated with a certain party, and they measured the swing voters' brain reaction, or their brain states when they were looking at a picture of John Kerry, and they found that there's high activation in a place called the amygdala, which is associated with like a lot of anger, aggression, anxiety. So they concluded that these swing voters, were just naturally anxious when they saw a picture of him. But They failed to mention, and other scientists have critiqued that study because it kind of became really popular, that this part of the brain is also very active during happiness, during excitement, and during sexual arousal. So, I mean, how would you, unless you ask the person what their experiences was, it doesn't matter how much, you look into their brain. So this is one of the ways to answer, like, yeah, the brain can tell you only so much, but you still have that subjective, only like introspective experience that nobody can ever, it's private, nobody could ever go that deep into yourself and tell you what you really feel. So the question is, are we just walking and talking brains, and we're just here by accident or that kind of thing? And okay, so we are walking and talking brains in a sense. Okay, my professor confirmed this in college. She said to me, we are walking, talking brains. Then I asked her, but do you think we are just walking and talking? Like, that's all there is about who we are? And she said, well, yeah, I do believe that that's what we are. So I kind of looked into it, like see if there's any philosophical or any kind of like ways to respond to this. And there's something called the law of identity in like basic philosophy, and it would be helpful to know it to kind of respond to this objection. And the law of identity says that if A equals B, A equals B if everything about A is the same thing about B. So nothing could be different about A. If something's different about A, if there's anything, different about A, but it's not, let me back it up. If there's anything true of A but not true of B, then A does not equal B. Does everyone understand that? It's like it's a really basic thing. It just has a name of the law of non-contradiction. Okay, so this is one of the basic laws of logic that you can use. So we could translate that into the topic of, are we just our brains? And so one of the things is that this is why I am not just my brain, okay? So my thoughts can be true or false, but my brain state can't be true or false. You can't look at my brain and say, that's a true thought or that's a false thought. You can say that there is something, a thought, but you can't say if it's true or false, okay? That's not, so I can't be my brain. My thoughts do not have a size, shape, or location. So my thought of being in church is not a circle, or is not it's not it's not like a shape, basically. So if you look at the brain and you measure it, you have a shape of that thought, but that doesn't mean that my thought of going to church is in my brain. Does that make sense? I don't know, it's kind of like, do you know?
Material versus material.
Yeah, in a sense.
Exists that, can something immaterial exist? Like, does that exist?
Yeah.
Like you can share your thought with someone else. Like you can tell me your thought, and then I can have that same thought. So, like that thought is not a physical thing. A thought is something.
Right.
So even if there's something that corresponds to it in your brain, that whatever's corresponding to is not the same thing as that thought itself.
Yeah. Yeah. So my thought of, going. Okay. But anyway, so my thoughts can be good or bad, but you can't look at a brain and be like, oh, that's a good brain, that's a good frontal, like that's good or that's bad. I mean, that wouldn't even make sense. But you can evaluate.
Can I?
Yeah.
So I think one of the fundamental truths, I guess, is that, and Joe spoke about this a few weeks ago. It sounds like from our perspective, because we don't believe in relative truth, what you're saying, yes. But for those, like for this to make sense for the other perspective, whatever the other perspective is called, truth has to be relative. Is that an over? Okay. So my thought can be true or false. Yeah. If everything is relative, so this is assuming assuming a relative worldview, for my thought, like, because if truth is relative, then there's no true or false. What is good or bad? What's appropriate and inappropriate, right? So
Okay.
it's really founded on the truth of truth.
Well, it's assuming that there is such a thing as,
That's truth. That there is absolute truth.
It's assuming there's such a thing as reality, that there's such a thing as
Yeah.
true reality.
or that there's such a thing as logic, and
Yeah. I guess the
and
reason I
you
bring that
can-
up is because for some people they'll say, but what do you mean truth? And so I guess I'm just saying, like, it really goes back to what Joe spoke about a few weeks ago about that's woven in there.
Right.
That's an understanding.
right. And I mean, this is not just about truth. You can go on forever, like appropriate, inappropriate.
Second point doesn't have any,
Right.
the second point's about immaterial versus material.
Yeah,
The first, third, and fourth.
yeah.
Others have an embedded premise.
It's assuming that there is some kind of reality, and we're talking about the same thing. So two things can't be the same if one is a little bit different, or you can say something different about it. Did you have something to say? Okay. So anyway, and also this is interesting. So if you say that someone is just their brain, there are certain very unique circumstances where that wouldn't be true, because this is a condition or a procedure called hemispherectomy. So they remove half of your cerebral hemisphere to prevent some kind of like epileptic seizures. And so does that make the person half a person if they have half of their brain? And a lot of the times after these kinds of procedures, people aren't functioning normally. They, there are some side effects in certain cases, but for the most part, people are very successful with these procedures, and they have half of their brains to a certain extent.
It's really just because the brain adapts.
Yeah.
It allocates new areas to take over the areas that were removed.
Yeah,
So they are technically still doing the same thing, just with less material.
right. So it's less again. So it's less material. The brain is remapping its neuroplasticity, but it doesn't mean that the person lost, half of themselves, or, even though they all.
If you got an area that they couldn't like reallocate or whatever, then they would be less of a person.
Right, but would that make them less of a person?
Yeah, they wouldn't be able to function. So like there was that famous study where that guy had like was like a railroad worker, and he had his
Phineas Gage.
Yeah, he had a spike go through his amygdala, and he was a totally different person afterwards, because the amygdala affects your mood, so he was like a grouchy person after, because his amygdala got severed pretty much.
Right,
He was still alive, he was just a little different.
right, but is he still a human being?
He's still a human being, his family don't understand he's not Phineas or whatever, he's just some dude now, because he's angrier.
Right, I mean, and that goes for anything, like, with disabilities or whatever. I mean, I work a lot with people with different cognitive disabilities, and they are in a way a different person. Like colloquially, we'll say they're a different person, but they're still a person. They're just unable to function the same way as before. So again, like, are we equating human function with the same thing as?
You're just equating that human function, that's all. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, and
So that's like, they are a different person and they don't have that function, so they are in that way different than they were before.
right. No, I agree with you. I was just the whole question of, are they still like less valuable? Are they less of a person? And some people would say yes, because if an animal is more valuable than a retarded human child, if you have that kind of worldview, then you're inclined to think that people with disabilities are less valuable. And so that kind of, you have to think about that a little bit. But anyway, in orthodoxy, so this is the last part, and we'll wrap up so we can maybe have a discussion. But that the human being in orthodoxy is viewed as it's called a psychosomatic unity. Psyche for the mind, and soma for the body. So it's a unity, and you can't say that the person is a soul, and a person is just their bodies. Like, you can't divide the person. So in a way, it's a very holistic worldview that we have in orthodoxy. So the body and the rational soul both constitute a whole person, and it's during death, which is also during the fall. This is what breaks the natural bond. Has anybody heard this term before? So orthodoxy is really a very holistic worldview. We don't have a dualism going on. We don't believe that there's something like separate, like the soul is this kind of separate substance than the body. Is that true? Okay. I don't want to be a heretic. So really, and also the orthodox view of the human being all has to do with who Christ is, like who God is and how he revealed himself to us. And in Colossians 1:15, Paul writes that he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. And we know, based on the surveys that people did earlier, that we are made in God's image. Okay. And so we are made in God's image, but the true image, who is that image? It's Christ himself. And we are made according to that. So everything that we see in Christ should reveal to us who we are as human beings. And this is, I mean, the fact of Christianity is the incarnation, that God became man, he became flesh, the word became flesh. And it's not just he was interested in saving our souls and forget about the body. No, he took on everything that it meant to be human, which includes a physical body. So the image of God is, some people will say image of God means being conscious, self-aware, rational, and all those attributes, which are true. But mainly when we look at the writings of the very early church fathers, like the Cappadocian fathers, they really see that being in the image of God is everything that makes us persons. So this is something that's very, they really elaborate on it in their theology. So there are three things that mainly make us persons, but they're not excluding other attributes. The first one is that we are free. And free doesn't mean that we can do whatever we want, or that we are not limited by, physical reality or the laws of nature. But free means that we have the freedom to choose or reject God. And in Deuteronomy 30, God says, I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing, therefore choose life, that both you and your children may live. So then this is the idea of true freedom as being a human being, that we are able to choose God and to choose living in communion with him. Okay, let me get back to this section. Okay. And also another one is that we are unique. So there are no identical persons. Every person there's nobody like anybody else. Like there's nobody like William. No one will ever be like William. Even if you had an identical twin, same DNA sequence, everything like that, they will never be the same person. You can never have two fingerprints that are the same. They are totally, different persons. And every person, a quote that I found really interesting was that sin is what forces upon us a sterile uniformity and reducing us to a life of mere animal existence. So the idea of sin and how that kind of corrupts our uniqueness is what makes us all, reduces us to just mere animal existence. But in reality, we are very unique and special. Just like the persons of the Trinity are unique. And the last part, the third one, which is probably the most important one, is that we are relational, and we relate to others, and we relate to the whole creation, the physical world, and we relate to God in a very special way that no other creature could ever, say the same, or they can't say anything at all. But it's also, being relational means relating to others, and with love and self-emptying. And there is no such thing as one person. So if you can't be a true person if you're just the only one. Then you're just like an individual. An individual is just a number. And in the ancient Greek philosophy, they believed that a person who's an individual, a selfish person who kind of did their own thing and wasn't contributing to society, they called them an idiot. That was actually the name of an individual, was an idiot. And persons is really the term that, that the church fathers, for the first time in human history, they gave that meaning. It was in the 4th century that the Cappadocian Fathers really gave meaning to personhood as we understand it today. Because there was no such word for persons. It was prospon, which meant just face. There was no word to describe like a person. And that's because they were trying to understand, or trying to explain who the person of Christ was. It wasn't just because we were interested in defining, who we are as humans. But one interesting quote I heard was that if you think about the famous René Descartes quote, "I think, therefore I am," it could be changed to, in this perspective, to "you love me, therefore I am." It's because others love me and others relate to me, therefore I am. Therefore I am a true person. So I thought that was really cool. But also, we relate to the whole of creation, that we can care for it. We are stewards. We're not being an exceptional human is not like you're kind of subjecting creation under you and you're possessing it, but you're really creating for it with the gift that God gave us as humans, the special, unique quality of being human. And when this includes doing science and understanding the brain more, understanding the world more, and that's all bringing glory to God. And we also bring the whole creation to God. And our hymnology, and I think we're going to do a hymn afterwards to kind of display how we, on behalf of all creation, we kind of, what is the term? We intercede for all of creation, of the trees and the plants and the animals and all the creeps around the earth. All that creeps around the earth. All the creeps. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know. But also with the whole personal and relational piece is names. Names are very important, and it's not just a name tag given to someone just for the purpose of having a name, but it's revealing like the essence, the true essence of the person. And perfect name for Mr. Bean, but like this is a way of humanizing someone. So if you're ever in a big, busy area like New York City and all you see is just numbers, it's probably because you don't know their names or something. But if you try and you humanize people, you personalize them by considering that they have a name, they have a family, they have all these things, and they relate to you in some way, and they share in your humanity. They're not just an individual. And an example of that is, animals. We personalize animals by giving the family pet a name. And it's not something you own, it becomes part of the family. Obviously, it's not a person or a human, but it still becomes part of your family because of you personalizing it, and that's part of bringing it into communion, as a whole with all of creation. We need to speed up. And then also, finally, we're made in the likeness of God, which means we have the potential to grow more and more into His image and become, what we call in Orthodoxy is theosis. So being made, theosis is the process of salvation. So yeah, so that's like our technical term for it, is becoming
Becoming like God.
Yeah, becoming like God. So St. Anthony just says, becoming by grace what God is by nature. And this is a quote by Father Demetrio. He's a theologian of the Eastern Orthodox. He says, the glory to which man is called is that he should grow more godlike by growing ever more human. So the more human we become, the more humanized and personal in our relationships with, everything around us and with God, the more we are being transformed and to become like God. And the human being is a term that is famously used in John chapter 19 when Pontius Pilate presents Jesus in front of all those who want to crucify him after he was wearing the crown of thorns and with the robe, and he says, behold the anthropos, the human being. And if Pontius Pilate said anything prophetic, it's probably this thing, that this is the human being. And he's presented as a person who is self-denying, and he is self-sacrificing for other people, for all of creation. And Philippians 2:6 it really depicts this really well. Who, being in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant, and coming in the likeness of men, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. So you get this imagery of what a true human being is, and it's what Christ shows us and how we are to follow his example. And finally, how this relates to the whole brain and neuroscience thing is that we look forward as Christians to life after death. We are not looking forward to going into heaven with just souls or just this, immaterial soul. We look forward to becoming, so we don't believe that we have this natural immortality of the soul, that our soul is just going to fly on somewhere and get us into heaven. That would be, in a way, anti-Christian, and it doesn't make sense of the incarnation and the resurrection. We believe that there is the resurrection of the whole person, the psychosomatic person, which is why when Christ is risen, he's risen in body, everything. He took back everything, and he rose as a full human being. So it's important. Our brains are important. Our bodies are important. Yes, they're going to be transformed and renewed, but we don't believe that, we have to fight between the brain and the mind. So it's okay that the mind, we are our brains. It's okay to say that. And there is no problem for us as Christians, as long as we understand, in addition to that, who we are as persons. And I'll just finish up with what St. Paul says in Romans 8, which is a really good chapter, Romans 8, starting from 18 to 28. It just tells us that all of creation is waiting for the revealing of the sons of God, which is us. All creation is waiting to be transformed and being renewed. But we also, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our body. So it's very clear that the Christian view is that it's a whole package, and the human is, all things combined.